Hello everyone, I'm Esther and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is our second session of the BOUNCE webinar series, which we started last month to help raise awareness on the topic of decarbonisation. To do that, we're inviting some of the industry's top experts so that they can share their knowledge and experiences with all of us. Just for those of you who may not know, our main mission here in Navozyme is to bring technological innovation into the maritime industry. Some of the maritime processes are still very traditional and haven't been keeping up to date with the latest technological advances. So we would like to help raise the standards on safety, security, and productivity, which would in turn help with maritime decarbonisation. So coming back to the webinar, we've got here today with us Dr. Ricardo Barcelona, an energy expert and author of the book Dynamic Decisions. He'll be having a conversation and sharing his insights with Navozyme's co-founder and chief executive, Anjaney Borwankar. So over to you now, Anjan.
Thank you so much, Esther. I'd also like to invite Dr. Ricardo Barcelona to join me. So Ricardo, if you can unmute yourself. And also, yes, I can see you now. That's great. Hello, how are you, Ricardo?
I'm fine. Good afternoon.
Excellent.
From my side. Good morning, I guess, to some of you. And I don't know if there's people attending in the early morning or late at night.
Yes, great. So Ricardo, I will, for the benefit of everyone, including the audience that's joining us only in the second part, give a brief introduction. I shall introduce you also to some of the people who may not be that familiar with your work. I will also recap what we did in the last webinar, because this is the second part of this webinar that we started with you on the topic of dynamic decisions, the new book that's coming out in actually a few days from now. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Anjaney Borwankar. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Navozyme. As my colleague Esther has already informed you, this is a webinar series. It's called the BOUNCE webinar series. And the focus really here is decarbonization. Decarbonization for all of us is a very important topic. As individuals in society, as representatives in the workforce, as leaders in business, society, or politics. The term decarbonization is becoming increasingly important. So what we are doing here is really inviting industry experts, people who have wealth of knowledge, experience, to share a little bit of that with us. So we also record these webinars, and you will have access to that as well. So even the previous session that we did with Dr. Ricardo Barcelona, I'll be referring to him as Ricardo. I know him for a few decades now, and really I've benefited a lot from his conversations with him on various topics. So a little bit about Dr. Ricardo Barcelona, for those not familiar, and I won't get into all the details, but he's been a senior leader in the traditional energy sector before with Shell for many years as a senior leader, including at the headquarters in Netherlands. He's an investment banker as well, and not just an ordinary one, someone who was top rated. He has a PhD later on in life from King's College, London. He's an alumnus of ESA Business School. So, you know, we are colleagues in that sense. This is his second book. So it's not his first book, it's his second book called Dynamic Decisions. We've had a brief introduction to what that book is about in the first session. And all of you, I encourage you to actually, listen to that. There's some very wonderful ideas. For the benefit of everyone, I will take a few moments to summarize the first webinar, so that this conversation also becomes very interesting and you don't kind of miss this sequel. So if you're watching the sequel, don't worry, we're going to give you a recap also of the first part, but very briefly. So the first book that you wrote, Ricardo, was really trying to argue that, the financial models in decision making are important, like NPV, etc., which is very used. But the context today is changing. So you can't take a prescription from that model because the NPV is positive and then kind of delegate the decision to the model, right? Human beings are at the center. The changing context is very much real. And that's what you kind of helped leaders think about, that changing the paradigm, that yes, use the instruments available to you, but don't delegate your decision making to the instruments. I think that's how I kind of took away the summary of the first book. This book that you've written, which is coming out soon, and it's available for pre-orders also for all our listeners, thanks to Ricardo, the publisher has gracefully recognize that you can give us a 20% discount. So later we'll have a promo of the book for those who want to purchase. I'm ordering 2 books and I want one of them signed by you, Ricardo. I know right now you're in the Philippines, but when you're back in Barcelona, maybe we get to meet you in person also. So quick summary, what is dynamic decisions and what did we actually discuss in the last webinar? So we started off by talking about the energy transition, and Ricardo, you argued 2 points. One was scale. The scale of the investment today is very, very important. So this is not something that anyone can ignore. From $1 trillion per decade about 30 years ago, it's become $1 trillion annual and increasing. So whether you like it or not, it's going to affect you. Then you talked about that it's moved away from technology being the driver. So we talked about animal power, then mechanical power, the birth of the internal combustion engine, and then the various sources of fueling that, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro, etc. Right? But what you mentioned is that really what's happening now is the human element is becoming more and more significant. So it is not just about which source of energy, but it is really about the equitable distribution of the benefits of that in society, and then the sustainability of that actually. So these are actually 2 important components that need to be taken into account when we look at the energy transition. We looked also then at, and just, I think it was very interesting to refresh the memory for especially the young listeners here. We talked about the horse manure crisis as well, right? So imagine the decisions that we take in society, so you walk in some of the major cities in Europe and imagine you're walking amongst horse manure and it's very smelly because your energy source was horses, right? And then we moved away to coal thinking that's a clean source. And now we have global warming, right? And again, I'm simplifying the whole story for the benefit of everyone. But the decisions we make in the energy transition as a society have big implications. And the context is changing. So really what we quickly got into was, what is this book, Dynamic Decisions, all about? And the main point here was the context is changing. So we argue that it's now a VUCA world, not just a VUCA, so not just volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, but also it's digital and decarbonization, right? So these 2 elements are very much part of the context that we live in today. And here, very practically, we are talking of changes at the industry level and also at the policy level. You gave a great example in our conversation last time about Repsol and how they face both the industry change, where there was pressure to move into renewables, and then the policy change, because in Argentina, for example, the government decided to nationalize their assets, right? And so what do you do as the CEO of the company there? And you gave a great example. Actually, your book has been even recommended by the chairman of Repsol. No, I believe it's a $20 billion company for those not familiar. So we're not talking of a small organization, a very significant energy organization that you have worked very closely with. And their CEO actually, their chairman actually puts in the book quite well that this book is important because it resolves the dilemma, or it gives some solutions towards resolving the dilemmas in society. So we are looking at policymakers wanting a green world, and then a traditional energy greenhouse gas generating company. It looks like they're on 2 sides of the pole, but can that be resolved? So you like to bring in the human element here. And we talked about also the energy pivot, PIVOT, you suggested how the energy transition can be done. I won't get into the details of that because it'll take too long, but again, encourage you all to listen to the first webinar. We'll share the link with all of you. But today, what we are going to focus on is really the icing on the cake, right? And I think the most important part here from a practical point of view, winning strategies. So I think everyone wants to win. There's energy transition happening, and you can see it as a problem, but also the other side of the coin is that it's a massive opportunity here. So basically in your book, and here, may I request my colleague Thomas to just share the structure of the book for a second so that it'll be easy for the audience to follow what we are doing. Fantastic. So I see it now. So here, we actually discussed the first 2 chapters of the book in some detail in the first part of the webinar. And now what we are going to focus on is what is called BOUNCE to win. So winning strategies, winning actions. And we want to actually keep the context, the VUCA context in mind and the human element in mind. So what Ricardo's work, really the pioneering part here is to again remind everyone that decision-making today is really a dynamic, context-driven situation. It's very important to keep the context of the industry, the context of policymakers, and what we talked about, like the VUCA world into consideration. So that's great, but how do you actually do that, right? And what are the examples that you've studied? So Thomas, thanks for sharing the screen. You can remove that now. So we're going to jump straight into what are the winning strategies here. So Ricardo, my opening question to you is, how do we win in this energy transition game? Please give us your suggestions.
Okay, great, Anjan. I think that's let's go for the jugular. Yeah. When we talk about managers being so worried about what to do with the future, yeah, there's one element that managers, or a vast majority of managers, would try to ignore, and that is the element of luck. Yeah, they want to ignore that for the simple reason nobody planned for it. Yeah. So as a consequence, yeah, in equal measure, almost, yeah, companies that failed has been managed or led by people of the highest caliber of intelligence, and probably managers who are probably the most risk averse. Now, so the question would be, why? If intelligence is not the differentiating element, what is? Yeah, I think this is where I bring in what Napoleon Bonaparte actually told us. I would prefer lucky generals as opposed to able generals. Yeah, I think the context behind that is that ability without opportunity is probably not going to lead you very far. Yes, now, so that brings us straight to what dynamic decisions is aiming to do. The first part of it is, instead of spending a lot of our time and a lot of our managerial effort, yeah, in trying to come up with a perfect strategy and a perfect contingency plan so that everything works perfectly, we have probably to recognize a few things that are uncertain. And because they are uncertain, there's probably no way to know that in advance. So the flip side is to prepare ourselves to be able to seize an opportunity when it presents ourselves. So here are 3 steps that we can connect to the first webinar. I think we spoke about repurpose, reframe, and reconfigure. So from a strategic implementation perspective, repurpose simply means you're actually trying to start a journey, which I refer to be a foundational pivot. Yeah, you're changing the whole foundation of your business. An example of that if an oil and gas company would like to move into a more renewable or service-oriented kind of business, as Repsol tried to do, then some of the advantages that it possesses, especially in logistics, and when they talk about logistics, oil and gas companies are known for their shipping capability. Yeah, they're very good at managing fleets. They're very good at moving things around. Probably in a decarbonized world, that may not be as important. Yeah, because you don't move wind around, you don't move sunlight around, you don't move geothermal reserves around. So there is an element of upscaling, there's an element of divesting, and there's an element of acquiring new knowledge. And that changes the whole foundation on which the business is built. The second element of that, of course, is how do you reframe a business? You reframe a business with an objective of creating transitional pathways. Yeah. So how do you move from an oil and gas or fossil fuel world into a more decarbonized world? Well, you basically start experimenting, and by experimenting, you're bound to get some results that you don't expect, and some results that probably validate what you expected. And this is what I call the ability, and this is where the human element becomes quite important. In experimenting and piloting, we try to tolerate more ambiguities and probably tolerate more, shall we say, failures in order to build in the ability to learn from the failures and the ability to learn from what works. And in the process, we can have a more flexible structure that would allow us to confront the challenges of a changing world. And finally, reconfigure. Yeah, so before we jump into reconfiguring mode, reconfiguring simply means committing to a transformational pivot. Yeah, you're really transforming the whole business that you have. And this is where the commitment comes with the ability to adapt, and adaptation means putting a premium on managerial flexibility. Yes, I think I'll stop at that point.
Fantastic, Ricardo. That's a great intro. So you've actually given us some 3 new R's, no? From the reduce, recycle, and reuse. We are moving into the Ricardo's 3 new R's. Okay, and we'll speak about that in more detail. I just want to also acknowledge, which I should have done earlier, the audience that we have. So the audience actually, and some are still connecting as we talk, are looking at the registration links. I recognize some friends also there, so hello to all of them. But we have people from Philippines, no surprise there. From Singapore, again, probably not that big a surprise. Spain. But we have people from also really other parts of the world, right? From the United States, Egypt, the United Kingdom, and many other countries, quite frankly. I can't go through all the list right now. But for the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will be picking up some of those questions as we go along. So you know, we'll make this interactive. We'll leave some time towards the end for any Q&A that you may have. So, but post them on the chat, and I will basically use my moderator's discretion to choose and pick. Okay, great. So continuing this conversation, you've given a preamble to what those winning strategies are, and really now it's something that's also in my area of interest and maybe some expertise also, is really the digital transformation. Because here is what you said in the part 2 and 3, the experimentation to learn, so that your tolerance, I love that word, tolerance for ambiguity increases. And that's very good, because you get insights into the potential new world that all of us are creating. So this is not the known, we are actually going into the unknown. So how do you get comfortable with that? And again, no financial model is really going to give you the right answer. So you've got to take into account all the changing landscape. So experiments are the best, quick experiments, cheap experiments, and there's really no failure in those experiments. It's just a learning from that, right? So in Navozyme, that's exactly what we do. We do a lot of piloting with a lot of traditional actors. And part of my job is to actually make them very comfortable during this transition that they are doing, right? So I'm happy that you already picked up on that. And then reconfiguration is, of course, based on that learning. How do you implement that and how do you scale that in the organization to get the benefits from these strategies? So here, Ricardo, do you want to explain the BOUNCE in more detail? Last time you gave us a teaser, but today we said we're actually going to give some frameworks for helping people take decisions, dynamic decisions, and hopefully win by those decisions. So the BOUNCE framework that you have created, can you elaborate on that?
Okay, the BOUNCE framework is where you connect the analysis that people would normally do or managers would tend to do, but it connects it in a very human way because the choices that we make has a lot to do with our belief. Yeah. If you believe that the world is round, then you're probably trying to pursue certain strategies that is consistent with that kind of belief. Yeah. And so therefore your belief would inform your outlook and would inform how you understand the world that you operate under. Yeah. Now, so that's the human aspect of it. And as far as the N, and that's not a typo, by the way, with a small n, yeah, it just so happened that incentive is spelled in the way it is, so N is the second letter of incentive. If you want to bring people along, if you want to bring stakeholders along to the transformational journey, then there should be some kind of a clear statement, yeah, where people could identify the points of alignment. And oftentimes, what is it for me and what is it for you? What is in it for you becomes an important question. Yeah? And that is informed by the financial analysis that we make. Yeah. So let's say, is it worthwhile investing in something, or is it worthwhile carrying on with what we have and then basically focus our whole investment program into improving the efficiency? Yeah. So for example, a coal-fired power plant that is being threatened with obsolescence. Yeah. If you continue to invest in operational efficiency, but at the same time, as we have seen in a number of European countries, well, probably not in the last few months because coal-fired plants are being refired again because of the shortage of gas, but not because all of a sudden people have changed their mind. It just so happens if you don't have water, you don't have hydro. If you don't have enough water to cool the nuclear power plant, you will not have nuclear production. So that is probably a more temporary stopgap measure to refire the coal-fired plant. But on a longer-term basis, if a technology is already being threatened with obsolescence, is it worth spending more to make it more efficient? Yeah. My answer is no, because a consequence of that is as you make an obsolescing technology more efficient, then the end result would only be one thing. You will just increase the excess supply from that obsolescing technology. And if you're not able to sell the output from that obsolescing technology, then chances are the bloodletting will just become worse and worse over time. Yeah. So, in contrast, if you have a technology, just like in the case of geothermal, in the case of hydro, where very little investment has been done in the past, yeah, and that's recognized to be something which is probably worthwhile, and And some sectors are also arguing for reintroducing the modular model of nuclear power plants into the system. Then this is really worth looking at in terms of its economics and in terms of its prospect to meet both objectives. One is to decarbonize and at the same time to produce and supply reliable energy to the system. Yeah, so that's one element of that. Now, so let's bring that to specifics. So what did Repsol do that is probably different from the others? Yeah, I think let's start with Repsol because we've mentioned about that. So again, just to recall what happened to Repsol. Repsol used to be called Repsol YPF. YPF is the Argentine part of it. The Argentine government decided one day, thanks to a lady called Cristina Fernandez, former president of Argentina, saying, now we want to nationalize YPF. Then all of a sudden, Repsol just woke up and find that half of the business is gone. Yeah. Now, fast forward into 2021 or 2022, as the case may be, throughout the process of restructuring the business, actually, Argentina may have, or the renationalization of YPF may have done Repsol a favor. Yeah, it is a favor because the CEO recognized that to be an opportunity to actually reframe the whole business. Yeah. So how did they reframe the business? Number one, they wanted to get out of the high risk emerging market risks and repurpose the exposure to the more, shall we say, developed European markets and probably North American markets, and probably strengthen in the area that they don't have much of a presence, which is Asia. Yeah, that they have done that. And thanks to the 6 billion payment from Argentina, all of a sudden, a company that is struggling to meet the expansion program and fund it, all of a sudden is awash with cash. Yeah. The other pivot that Repsol was trying to engineer was to move from a supplier of products, meaning lubricants, petroleum products, gas products, into a provider of services. Yeah, and a provider of services simply means that, well, if people would like to get into renewable or a low carbon type of technology, what do they have? Well, they have the money, but probably they could do some help from an established player in the energy sector to manage the project and to manage the transition and to manage the investment and even the operations. And that's the kind of service that Repsol has thought up. Yeah. So in the process, again, fast forward to 2030 or 2050, Repsol was confident enough not only to promise or to commit to deliver a 40% cut in their CO2 emissions, but actually continually increase those targets into something more ambitious. Yeah, so that's that would require Repsol to actually reconfigure. And this is where I think, Anjan, where something you have mentioned about a sleepy energy company becoming very dynamic. Yeah, and this is where not only are we talking about decarbonization, we're actually talking about digitalization. Yeah, and the role of digitalization here is that the question I often ask consumers and managers at the same time is, why is it that with all the opportunities presented by decarbonization and energy transitions, very little action seems to be taken by both consumers and managers with regards to energy efficiency, with regards to changing the way we fuel our industry and our transport? Yeah. The short answer is Well, there is no way for us to actually get the data to inform our decision. Yeah, and digitalization is probably going to change a lot of that. Yeah, because with digitalization, and we can learn from your experiences in the maritime industry, say, well, if somebody can tell me in real time, this is my carbon footprint and this is how it's going to evolve, I'm going to be probably more conscious, yeah, about the way I deploy my resources and the way I use my energy. Yeah. So that's one example.
Fantastic, Ricardo. You've actually made a nice segue into the maritime industry. A lot of our audience is actually coming from the maritime industry. Navozyme focuses on this industry primarily. And what your book is really about is trying to give the message that, you know, some of these frameworks are actually industry agnostic. They're universal. So the book is not necessarily about a particular industry, but it takes examples from different places. And we have a small section, and thanks, Ricardo, for inviting us for that. So Professor Giulio Toscani, who's our advisory board member, and I wrote a section giving an example of how we can contribute towards the measurement of the carbon footprint, right? So here is where Navozyme's one of our solutions, right? Which is basically what it does is it helps the people know the exact quantity of the different categories of waste, MARPOL, it's called Marine Pollution Regulation. So how that can be tracked in almost real time, right? And then as we look at the global discharge of different types of waste from ships, like you just mentioned, the first step is really just being conscious and having the data in good shape. So the quality of the information is very important. So this is where Navozyme is working, and we have elaborated that in one of the sections in your book as well, right? And it goes to show how the WUCARD world, you know, the two Ds are actually very intertwined. So when we talk of decarbonization, we can't forget digitalization as well. So it's not independent of each other. And that's what's being kind of argued in the book here. So what I'd like to do here is maybe bring it down to, you know, from the conceptual level to a practical level, right? So here, you've already given us an excellent example from Repsol. Are there any other examples that you would like to highlight to again, you know, bring out the practical elements of how a leader could go about making their decisions in this WUCARD world?
Yeah. Well, one example that comes to mind is actually a conversation I had with Michael Langley. Yeah. So Michael Langley is the CFO, Chief Financial Officer of RAG of Austria. So RAG, Austria. That is the largest gas storage company in Eastern Europe and probably, and Central Europe that is, and most probably one of the largest gas storage companies in Europe. Yeah. Now, what is so great about a gas storage company? Yeah, I think the impression when we talk about gas storage is probably very similar to what hits most people when you talk about utilities. And I'm not sure about maritime industry. I'm sure there's more excitement in shipping than, let's say, in gas storage. Yeah. Now, my conversations with Michael brought two things to light. Yeah. Number one is, yes, there is actually a great future for gas storage. Surprising, isn't it? Yeah. So where is that for opportunity coming from? He actually posed a very provocative question to me when we were preparing the chapter where I featured RAG of Austria as an example. And that question is, would you rather store electricity? In other words, would you rather store power, which using the present technologies tends to be very expensive? Yeah. And if you store fuel, which is, or the feedstock, which is storing hydro in a pump storage, or leaving the geothermal steam on the ground, which is a lot cheaper. Yeah. Would you go to the trouble of making that work, which is almost an economic and financial impossibility at present? Or would you rather store the electricity in a form that is useful or creating useful products? Yeah. So I said, okay, the second part of the question is probably quite interesting. So how do you do it? I said, well, there are two ways of treating excess power from wind farms and from solar farms. Yeah. If you look at it, look at the UK, you look at Germany, you look at Spain, the headline of the newspapers would always say, this weekend we had more than 100% of our production being covered by renewable. That's a good news. The bad news is if you're producing more than 100% of the demand, so that means the implication is whatever excess you throw away. Yeah, and that's what we call curtailment of the supply. Yeah. Now, when you curtail a power plant, then you basically say either you don't buy what they produce, in other words, you throw it away, or you shut it down. Yeah. Then I would say, okay, great stuff, right? With all this new and clean energy that we have invested billions of dollars, and then you just say, okay, we had just too much wind this weekend, so we're not using it. So here's the proposition from a company like RAD. This is, well, we're going to convert that into hydrogen. We can convert that into other useful energy forms. Yeah, and in this case, I'm using hydrogen as an example because it's a more obvious one. What is the highest cost component of hydrogen? Why is it so expensive to convert anything like water or ammonia or gas into hydrogen by breaking the chemical formula or the chemical structure of the compound? Yeah, electricity is going to make it so bloody expensive. Yeah, it's bloody expensive because it requires so much energy. Now, if the energy that you're going to throw away, you can use it for converting water or for converting gas into hydrogen and then store it in some of the storage facilities that you already have, then you've got actually two wins. One, you're creating a product that will use your storage, and both will ensure that you do have a future in a decarbonized world. Yeah, so that's, I said, well, that's an interesting part. Of course, the second aspect of that, this reminds me of what I have now called the Dom Perignon phenomenon. Yeah. So what is a Dom Perignon, or what has champagne got to do with the gas business? Or what does champagne got to do with the energy business? Probably in the maritime industry, champagne has a very specific role. Yeah, when you commission a ship, you break a bottle of champagne to start a journey. Yeah, not in energy. Well, just to digress a little bit, a monk called Perignon, or Dom Perignon, and that's where the brand came, was basically surprised one day when he went down to the cellar and then saw broken bottles. Yeah, so he started to pick up one of the bottles that he was trying to keep in the cellar, and he noticed massive fermentation of the wine. Yeah, and so when he opened it, of course, there's a popping sound, and he said, "My goodness, this whole inventory of wine is just going bad." Yeah, he said, "Well, I might as well try it rather than let it go to waste." And the rest of that is history. Yeah, Dom Perignon rushed back to the monastery and say, "Well, I have never tasted something like heaven. And if this is what heaven looks like, I'm all for it. So you see, monastery not only contributed religion and civilization, but they gave us a good tipple as well. Yeah. Now, how did that relate to gas and hydrogen? Well, one of the challenges of the scientists of RAG of Austria is to say, how do we decarbonize the gas that we have? Yeah, in other words, reduce the component of CO2 emissions. Well, accidentally, what they found was that by pumping the hydrogen that they were producing from the excess power from solar farms and wind farms and mix that accidentally with the remaining gas in some of the empty caverns that they use in Austria, they discovered one thing: the carbon component or the CO2 emissions in the cavern has actually gone down. So the next thing that they tried to test is to say, okay, did it escape into the atmosphere? So they tested the surrounding areas and no, the CO2 level has actually gone down as well. I said, so if there is a natural way, which incidentally what they discovered or what they suspected, it seems to trigger into hyperactivity some of the natural bacteria that reside in the empty caverns, and the bacteria started to basically reconfigure and transform the chemical component of hydrogen and the remaining gas to reduce the carbon or the CO2 content. Then they say, well, if this is something that they could scale and this is something that could be proven to work, then surely we have a natural way of decarbonizing fossil fuel. Yeah. Now, don't hold your breath. Michael was very clear about that. So, well, we're probably about 10 years away from any definitive answer to that according to the science that we use, or according to a science that we are following. So watch this space and see whether we're going to experience a Dom Perignon experience repeated in the gas storage business.
Yeah, that's firstly wonderful story. I wasn't aware of how champagne originated, so that's interesting. And also, this phenomenon, the only other comment I have on what you just said is the technology is evolving so fast. And again, when we say exponential change, really it's a mathematical function at the end. Initially it looks like almost irrelevant, and then the next day it's taken over the entire society. We have seen that with many things. So, it's not to be underestimated, even the timeframes in which these change can occur. But I think, again, returning to your book, and of course, winning strategies is the last part. No, it's the kind of summarizing all the other things. And what we're doing in this is really a sequel to the first webinar, where we explored really how this energy transition is happening, how the change is really, what do we mean by the VUCA world in some more detail. So you've given a lot of examples. One question came into me, and again, I think we are already at the 45-minute mark. Time flies super fast. So I'll be wrapping up in the next few minutes. One question came into me, which basically, I think you've touched upon it, but I'll still ask, is in this current crisis that we have, the geopolitical crisis with a waging war and a possible, spark in Asia. I'm referring to the Taiwan-China situation as well with the US. So, basically the geopolitical situation is delicate, right? So how do you actually see the energy transition with that? Are we going to revert back to the known sources like you already mentioned? Coal is again, being used as an energy source even in Europe. But what's your opinion on that? So it's not directly related to the book, but I think they're taking advantage of you as an energy expert to get your opinion.
Well, to the contrary, Anjan, I think that's actually chapter 1 and 2 of the book. Yeah, in the context of how markets operate. Yeah, so let me just start describing how we got into the situation where we are, which is a complete reversal of what happened in 2020 and 2021. Yeah. So 2020, 2021, you had the lockdown, yeah. And if you're familiar with how the energy market works, especially the power sector works, yeah, the prices are being set by the marginal supply. So in this case, the marginal supply tends to be gas, or in some cases would tend to be coal. Yeah? Now, so if the volume would go down, then also the first capacity that you take out of the system would be the marginal supplies, which would be coal or gas. Yeah. Now, so what happened in 2020 and 2021? Yeah. Well, not only was volume going down, you have a lot of rain, you have a lot of wind, yeah, and between the two, it basically helps to have a very good level of production from nuclear, yeah, and very good production from hydro, and very good production from wind. So in the case of Spain, 30% of the market was actually supplied by the wind farms. Surprising, isn't it? Yeah. Whereas in some markets, wind could probably only manage about 1% or 5%. Yeah. Now, so with that kind of situation, you end up with coal and gas practically being mothballed. Yeah, because nobody wants it. Not because nobody wants coal or gas, but there's just not enough demand for it. Yeah. So fast forward to 2022, we talk about climate change or changing climate or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. So you have the Russians wanting to invade or have a special operations rather in a country called in their neighbor called Ukraine. Yeah. Of course, everybody seems to retaliate against them. So the focus was on the curtailment or the cutback in gas supplies. Yeah. Now, if you cut back gas supplies at the same time, you're suffering from drought. Yeah. Or the rivers are drying up. Wind is not blowing as much as they used to. So you've eliminated the hydro, you've eliminated the wind, you've also eliminated the gas. And where does nuclear stand in all of this? Well, the river or the water from the river in France was too hot to cool down the nuclear power plants. Then nuclear is not producing as much as well. In fact, it's producing about half of the volume that it was producing. So supply squeeze not only on gas, but also on the other sources of energy leaves you with only one available source, which is coal. Yeah. Now, so all of that is actually economics, and there's no new paradigm involved in this, but it's really doing the sums, doing the numbers, and understanding how the system works. Yeah. To understand where we are. So that's why I'm probably making a rather bold forecast here that this is not something that would persist for a very long time. You're probably going to see this for the next few months. But as the rainfall starts to normalize or starts to go back to a more normal level, yeah, and the wind flow would normalize, then you have cooling water available for nuclear, then the more probable scenario is that power prices will start to fall, energy prices will start to fall, and if you believe in a recession, yeah, demand will start to fall. And if nobody wants your product, you can price it for as much as you want. If nobody's buying it, you're bound to reduce the prices. Yeah. So the lessons from all of this is that any energy transition is not a linear process. It is going to be recursive, tentative, and the implication of that is the pendulum would go back and forth. Yeah. So as they say, you know, a swallow doesn't signal that the spring is coming from after a harsh winter. Well, in the same way, that a drought and a hot summer doesn't simply mean that, you know, everything that has to do with decarbonization can be thrown off the shelf and say, okay, we're now back to the brave old world as we knew it.
Fantastic. So this was really, great for you to explain what exactly is happening from your perspective. And for me, it's been very beneficial. Again, we are repeating here, but really, repurpose, reframe, reconfigure it seems like common sense, but I think, you've very well illustrated how that should be applied for those who are doing energy transitions here. So we're out of time. So Ricardo, again, thanks so much for sharing the insights. For the audience, if you still have any questions, feel free to send that to us, and I will forward it to Ricardo to reply directly. We will also send you the link to the previous session, and I encourage all of you to take a look at the book. So here, what I'd like to do, and then I'll give you again, just to say thank you, Ricardo, to the audience. But Thomas, Esther, my colleagues, if you can share the flyer of the book, maybe I can talk about that for a second. Yes, so it's appearing here. So we'll do a short promo. So this book is Dynamic Decisions. And again, we've actually spent a couple of hours already discussing this through Navozyme. There's a chapter also on Navozyme there. So that's not chapter, actually, it's a small section there to talk about how the digitization of the maritime industry is happening and how that contributes towards the facilitating the decarbonization. For the viewers of this webinar and anyone who are friends of Navozyme, there is a promo code and you get 20% off on the book. I have read a few chapters already, and really it's a very well written, well edited book. Every line really is like a punch, So again, congratulations, Ricardo, for all your hard work in publishing this. It's many years of work summarized in this book. And also thank you really for joining all of us and supporting this webinar series. So any final words from you before I pass it to Esther?
Well, thank you, Anjan, for organizing this. And again, at the end of the day, if you don't have an information as a feedback loop into informing you about the outcomes of what you're doing, then it's very difficult to move forward in the decarbonization journey. And thankfully, technologies are now being created on the digital front that would actually facilitate in the provision of that information in real time. And I think for that, I'll pass you on to Anjan. I think, Anjan, you're the better person to describe what that digital technology could do wonders, not only to the energy industry or the maritime industry, but to a broader range of applications as well.
Yes, thank you, Ricardo, again for your kind words here. So really this series, the BOUNCE webinar series that we call it, and we have other webinars also which are not related to decarbonization, but we thought this was important to help raise awareness on this issue, and also for us to gain a better understanding directly from experts in the world, because there's a lot of misinformation also out there. So we are doing a small contribution. Our webinars are always free of cost. Anyone can join, and we record them. We share that also with the audience. We have a few people lined up, and we will be confirming the dates very shortly. And really, people who are who's who in the world of decarbonization. So we've just got confirmation from also Dr. Sanjay Kuttan, who is the Chief Technology Officer from the Global Center of Maritime Decarbonization from the Singapore government. So it's a very important institution there with a lot of funding to help promote decarbonization in maritime particularly. So we'll have that as a session. I've also got confirmation from Professor Giulio Toscani, who has also contributed to this book. And he's an expert on the digital transformation part of it. So really, it's kind of a nice segue as to how decarbonization and digitization are connected. So we may host that as a panel discussion, and I may invite you also, Ricardo, one more time, for a discussion along with Giulio on that. So for the audience, again, thank you for joining all of us. Put in your questions. You can still send it to us, and we are going to, I'll request Ricardo to answer that. Keep in touch with us for the future webinars, and any comments are also welcome here. So thank you, everyone. This has been wonderful, and I hope it's been a good learning journey also for all of you. To my friends who I know some of you are watching, again, hello from Singapore. We are all well here in spite of all these changes in this VUCA world that we live in. So with that, I would like to pass it back to Esther for any final comments and the closure. And again, Ricardo, thank you. Really a pleasure having you here.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Esther, over to you.
Hi, Anjan, thank you. Yeah, so just wanted to say thank you for everyone for connecting with us today. You will be receiving the link to the recording shortly via email. And as Anjan already mentioned, you can get a 20% discount on the book by writing the promo code of Navozyme 20. Well, please follow us on our LinkedIn page so that you can keep up with any of our updates, and we hope to see you again on our next webinar. Thank you.